I'm going to start with the score, because I think that just gives away everything in one neat sentence. Plus 16 to story. Plus 1 to gameplay. So, before everyone jumps in the comments to say, yes, I do know that they decided to continue this game in comic form, rather than trying to make another game. And perhaps based on that, that was a good idea. But at the same time, well, the score is still barely positive on the gameplay axis. I've done a lot of analyzing and a lot of thinking and a lot of playing and a lot of experience in actually trying to dig into how platformers work over my years. I recently, just a few months ago, did an entire look at pretty much the entire Mega Man franchise, with a couple of noteworthy exceptions. So, I feel like it's pretty easy to point to the problem, and it's actually very simple. The levels are, not particularly interesting for the most part, but there's some cool gimmicks, there's some cool stuff. There's some interesting platforming escalation going on here and there. There's a cool hyper beam moment when we capture free Faraday. There's some cool little sequences. The game really shines at its best when it's doing anything other than the core gameplay. Running around, platform jumping, punching, and shooting your grenade is just not interesting, and it has its other problems. I'll go and discuss those now. So the grenade is interesting in its own right. It feels like it would be a cool tool. It kind of isn't. Its physicsing is just a little bit off, and it tends to get in the way more than not. I do know you can get rid of it to get an actual gun or something more useful in place of it, but the core grenade mechanic is just kind of And even the lobbing arcs that it can do and the durations and whether or not it hits on something or not is just kind of its own problem. The punching is, of course, rather disinteresting, especially since, well, I was playing with mouse and keyboard from about the second stage onward. I'll talk about that in just a moment. But the punching is just punching. There's nothing to it. It doesn't do anything other than destroy whatever's in front of you or do some damage to whatever's in front of you. You can change it to make it a charge or a long range, or you can give it a little bit of an AoE. That's it. And the big problem with both of these things is the controls. I don't know how to properly describe this, so please believe me when I say that the controls for this game suck. It is extraordinarily hard to properly explain. So, because it's not like, oh, well, it's just inconsistent. No, that's easy. That's just jank. This game does have jank. There's absolutely some physics jank going on. And the game also, when it comes to its platforming side of thing, doesn't do any of the, or at least didn't do it that I can notice, any of the things that help to assist with platforming. We've talked about this several times before. I forget the mechanic and how it's properly called, but game design does little things to nudge you in where it thinks you should go, right? We had a whole discussion about this some time ago, and with regards to the Marios and the Mega Mans both. And a good game will be like, oh, well, clearly, once what it's actually calculating is here's the ledge and here's you bonking about 3 pixels below the top of the ledge. Clearly, what you wanted to do is go here. So like in a Metroid or a Mario, you grab the ledge because, this is what you're trying to do, so here you go. Little helpers like that. Nudges, slight movements, a little additional maneuvers, stuff like that. This game has none of that. So if you bonk the ledge, you fall to your death. The end. Some people prefer that. I am not one of those people. So the platforming is janky and doesn't do anything to make it really interesting. And we have the grenade problem, and we have the punch problem, and we have the controls problem. But I haven't really properly described the controls. How do I describe the controls? So I started off with a controller, because it's a platformer, and it was wrong. So it kept taking inputs double, but in the wrong direction. So for example, if I was to hit the down button on my thing, B or the blue X, for example, that would make him jump, but also advance dialogue. So I'm just sitting here doing this while I'm reading the dialogue because it's taking both inputs at the same time. It also wouldn't let me do stuff on the D-pad, except sometimes it did. So I had to be trying to do precise jumps with the analog, while at the same time trying to aim in order to do the shots. Now, the one thing that worked well was the R2, R1 thing. That was fine. But eventually I realized that I was having more issues than I should because it just wasn't working. I was like, okay, fine. Let's try mouse and keyboard. Immediately, within 10 seconds, it was much smoother and clearer, and it felt like it was actually designed for a mouse and keyboard in mind, especially when we got to the section where we had the smoke grenades, that leave platforms for you. Cool, that's cool. A couple other problems. Mouse and keyboard obviously has its own issues with trying to do precision platforming. I actually died several times to it, deciding that, no, you didn't actually hit the space bar. even though it's kind of hard to miss hitting a space bar on a digital keyboard. But my favorite thing was the mouse clicks. Left click is the grenade, right click is your primary attack. And also, sometimes it just would have inconsistent, like you couldn't mash it the way you probably should be able to. So instead it was just kind of, and all of this means the entire game was very frustrating and irritating to play. And I didn't actually die that often, with one notable exception. I'll come to that in just a second. So it wasn't actually that hard of a game. Or maybe I shouldn't say that. That sounds elitist. I'm sorry. Platformers are one of my big things when it comes to game design and as well as game playing. I know platformers extremely well. I smashed through Mega Man 5 in 2 hours with like 3 deaths. So yeah, okay, I shouldn't say that. I apologize. I do think the game is not well designed, but I don't think it's hard. That's what I mean by that. I do think there are several bullcrap sections and bullcrap traps, which are designed to kill you, and that's not good. So if you had issues with that game, I'm not trying to throw any kind of shade. Some of you have even heard of this game. But, well, I mentioned dying a bunch. So I beat the game, and then I'm sitting through the ending, and I'm like, this feels like the bad ending. Like, this is not great. What the heck? And there's these even things saying there's another way. And I'm like, okay, well, how do I get the good ending? Turns out, so I had been doing all the levels because, of course, the goal for any of these reviews is to do as close to 90% of the content as we can. What I define as 90%, which is all the content. So I guess I should just say 100% of the content and not be confusing about my terminology, but I'm a moron. So I get to this one stage, and I go and I rescue Faraday, and then we go do some other stuff, and then we go some other... I make sure to get her the power-up. She becomes a goddess. It's terrifying. All sorts of stuff. I do all the stages, and I'm like, okay, I've done all the stages. Move forward. Bad ending. Turns out I missed a stage. Because when you rescue her, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to fall into the death pit, and then go rescue her buddies, and then beat the stage. Okay. So I go back to get back to that section, and rescue her buddies, and then say, well, can I just exit the stage now that I've quit? Nope, you have to beat the stage again. Okay, so I go back through the stage. This is the third time now, in order to get back to it, rescue our buddies, and then what proceeded to happen was that all of the problems I've already mentioned with the game just kind of smash into the face during the hyper beam moment of the escape. And I ran into the dumbest, just random nonsensical luck problems, like accidents. So have I mentioned that the enemies, because I haven't talked about this yet, the enemies' projectiles have a form of collision. Now, they won't actually bonk you, but they will cancel your momentum. So, jump, bonk, thonk is kind of how that goes, and you plummet to your death. Okay, that sucks in its own right, but more to the point, there's this one type of enemy. It's a flying drone, and it just hovers there. And its position is relative to you, regardless of all of the consideration. In fact, I saw quite a few bugs where these things would enter not only into cutscenes, but into boss fights, and would keep shooting at where you are, even though you're in the giant mecha in the background. It's just shooting over there. These things suck. They anchor to you, and they're perfectly designed to be at an upwards angle where it's difficult to shoot them with the only ranged weapon you have in your arsenal. The only reliable method to kill them is to jump up, and they, of course, go up with you because they're tethered to you, shoot, fall, and they're still tethered to you, and then be able to hit them on the rebound, or not the rebound, the descent of the shot. And even that isn't 100% consistent because they themselves like to just randomly do whatever when it comes to hovering around you. Their shots aren't even aimed at you. No, seriously, at one point I actually stopped dead and let them shoot at me, and they missed me consistently like 80% of the time. Couldn't hit me when I was standing still, because that's not what they're aiming for. They're aiming for your jump arcs. They're shooting where the game thinks you're going to jump to interrupt your jump arcs. This is irritating on every level. So, between all that, we ended up just YouTubing the other ending, because I just was sick of it and I was running out of time, and frankly, I've only got so many hours in my life to deal with this. So, all of this means this gameplay kind of sucks, right? And you're like, Lord, hold on. I'm paying attention because I'm smart and I'm awesome. And you are both of those things. You noticed that this game got a +1 to gameplay. What pulls it up? 2 things. It's actually 2 things expressed multiple times, but it is 2 things. I could pull it down to only 2 obstacles? 2 points? 2 concepts? We'll go with concepts. That's a good word. 2 concepts. 1, the boss battles. The very idea of fighting as the giant mecha, as the boss battle, while the little hero is running around doing their own thing, that's actually pretty awesome. It not only means that it's a nice change of pace, but more to the point, it means every boss fight is different, because you're never going to be fighting in the same way. Because obviously most bosses are different. Mega Man 1, each of the boss fights is different. That's not what I mean. I mean, if you look at the core combat of running around, punching, and shooting your grenades, well, that sucks. But even a game that has a good core combat generally has you playing the same way, even if the bosses are different. But because you function as the boss, the core combat is different for every single boss fight. So each boss fight is its own particular minigame, and that actually elevates the game substantially. Similarly, there are several what I like to call Princess Peach sections, no pun intended, where you end up going through the game or a level or a section of a level in a completely different manner. The two most obvious examples of this are, one, when you go into the underwater section, which is effectively a breather level, with Apodoida, or however you pronounce her name. I have no idea how to pronounce that. The Insect Queen. And you just kind of maneuver your way through there. And the second one, it's a great sequence, by the way. The second one is when you're on horseback with the Dwarven Princess going to heist a railroad train. Both of these are nice, substantial changes in core gameplay, and are much better designed overall, much more interesting, and much more fun. So that's what actually elevates the gameplay up to be a net positive, if only barely. But you'll notice I haven't talked about the narrative side of things. Now I'm going to kind of race through this a little bit, because I'm actually going to recommend at this point that you go watch the game. You heard me. You can watch my playthrough if you want. I voice act everything, because I usually do. But I mentioned this because, like I said, I don't think the gameplay is super hot, but the story got a plus 16 to story. What do you want from me? The core premise is already interesting. Oh, not playing as a villain. We've done that before. The core premise is actually the status quo being altered. What happens in the first stage is we go through and we're, we will steal the princess and go back. And the hero's like, I'm the hero. And we're like, And then the hero says, I'm sick of this. Bye. And there's no actual boss battle. It's just like, now what? And that's the narrative drive right there. We've been trying to do this big evil plan to gather these princesses to power this device. Our secretary, Becky, who's awesome, by the way, who got a plus by herself, shows up and she's like, hey, boss, what's our plan? Do we have a plan? We have a plan, right? We've never gotten past the kidnap the very first princess phase, so I've never actually figured out what the plan is. Oh, right. We had a plan. God, I've just spent so much of my life trying to turn animals into robots. Oh, hell, Robotnik. I'm going to have to turn that off. So that's the actual core premise. I mean, yes, we're playing as the villain, and that's cool and whatever, but narratively speaking, we're still the protagonist, and honestly, the good ending is us kind of going on a pseudo-redemptive arc. We're playing Bowser. Everyone in chat pointed out, 4 separate people in chat independently all pointed out that this is like Bowser. Because if you've seen me cover any of the Mario games, both RPGs and the platformers, but especially the RPGs where Bowser is actually a character, he's not evil. He's got the whole, I'm a villain. But no, he's a lovable, adorkable doofus. He is often the comic relief in a good way, not even like in the dumb way, more in like he's the one cracking the joke kind of a way. He's awesome. That's who we were playing for the most part. There's so many signs of us, we offer health care, and we make sure to stock the ship, our evil lair, with like all kinds of things to make sure that Princess Mayapple is actually taken care of and comfortable. We've never used the brig on our ship before. We have a masseuse licensed on board. Do I need to keep going? You get my point. That's awesome. But the fact that it's like, oh, we won. We got the first princess. Now what? And this is when the game shows its other good chops. So I've already mentioned 2 of them, characters and plot. The third is world building. Despite being a nonsensical pastiche, nonsensical is the wrong word. Despite being a seemingly nonsensical pastiche of, your typical video game world, there's actually a decent amount of work and effort put into how the rules of this setting work. There's an actual intangible power to being a princess of a kingdom, and it actually applies in a literal, tangible way. This also has there's some other things we find out about the politics of what's going on and who interacts with what and why this group is here. There's an evil syndicate league where Each villain is basically assigned a territory, and that's your territory, and there's all sorts of rules about how you coordinate. There's this wonderful bit where we fight this one dude. I don't remember his name. Doctor, I'm evil. And he's like, you have defeated me, but we're still on for poker, right? Yeah, don't worry. I'll bring the chips. You bring the salsa and soda. Cool, Brofist, and we're out. And the game is littered with little stuff like that. It treats villainy in the cartoony, lighthearted sense, the not actually evil sense. I like that, by the way. I'm actually rather in favor of that. It's actually something I also tend to enjoy about how Dr. Wily is usually portrayed. Yeah, I know, he's evil, sure. But you get the idea, right? So the whole game does this, by the way. As we go through, we learn more and more about how the world works. In fact, during the good ending, we find out that there is rules magic involved in having the power of a princess, because Becky rules lawyers and legalese her way into becoming a princess by the legal definition of the word, and in so doing, gains the power of a princess in order to power the device and become the final boss. And that's awesome. But there's one other thing this story does really, really well. And I want to give special praise to it. Because, yeah, sure, all the princesses are awesome, and their characters are there. Actually, hang on, I want to cover character one more time, because there's one brief thing I forgot to mention. I usually think of characters in three categories. One-dimensional, two-dimensional, three-dimensional. I've used these terms before. A fully three-dimensional character is someone who's, a person, like a real-life person. A one-dimensional character is exactly what they sound like. They really only have one character trait, that's it. Not necessarily a bad thing, it's worth noting. There's not much to Sauron in the movies, but, he still works, right? But a two-dimensional character usually is more interesting to talk about, because effort is being made to flesh them out, but obviously due to either limitations of time or budget or creativity or whatever, you can't actually flesh them out into a full three-dimensional character. After all, to be perfectly blunt, a fully fleshed out three-dimensional character requires more time than a 5-hour video game. So, what do we have instead? Two-dimensional characters. They're this, but also this and this and this and this. And they're this, but they're like this and this and that and this. And they're also this and this. And you flesh them out. You add traits. You add variances. You add layers to them. The more layers you have, the more dimensions you have, the more interesting of a character you have. And pretty much every character in this game is a fully fleshed out two-dimensional character. And it works very well, especially because of the thing I was about to mention that I interrupted myself on, which is the connections between them. This is something I've been pushing a lot since I covered DS9 from my perspective, which is 2 years ago now. That is such a weird thought, by the way. Those videos are still going live. Oh, wait, no, they're not. The DS9 video stopped. That's right. It's the Enterprise videos now. No, God, that means it was 3 years ago. I did the TOS and Enterprise stuff 2 years ago. How long has it been? It's been a while. But one of the things I've been really a champion of ever since I covered DS9 from my perspective was the connections between characters. I love this. I love this because you can have a character and you can have a character, and they may or may not be interesting, and they may or may not stand on their own, and they may or may not be cool, but the way that they gel together, the chemistry, the interactions, the tie between them, whether it's antagonistic or positive or friendly or romantic or rivalry or familial or whatever, it doesn't matter. That connection by itself can take on its own form and be its own character and be a part of the story. And this game actually does that quite well, surprisingly. Just about every character bounces off of or interacts with other characters. It's usually just one, right? Like we've got Dwarf Princess and Ogre Prince is a good interaction. Becky interacts well with us. We interact well with Mayapple. You get the idea. We also interact well with Apoidia, and Apoidia also interacts well with Mayapple. You get the concept. There are several good connecting threads between the characters, and that's awesome. This has been a very weird game to cover. I do hope, as ever, that you have enjoyed my thoughts. And I'll be covering, I think, the Magic Circle. Whoop, I actually spelled it wrong. I'll be covering the Magic, with a C, lore, circle next. And I do hope at least something will be for that. Otherwise, I will see you next time.